memorandum of agreement says that the Orioles and the Stadium Authority would mutually agree on the name of the stadium. And the stadium was referred to as Camden Yards publicly. That's how people thought of it, as Camden Yards. And Eli Jacobs thought it should be called Oriole Park, which was like the park that had been burned down.
So after I left the governor's office, one of my first clients was the Orioles. In those days, there wasn't this thing called a cooling off period. Good news, or I probably would have been unemployed. But you could hire somebody who just left government even if you had a matter before them in government. I just couldn't work on a specific thing that I'd worked on then. So I couldn't have worked on the funding or the authorization of Camden Yards, but I could work on anything else related to it. I could work on the development of the project. I could work on the naming of the project, whatever it happens to be. So Lucchino called me up and said, this is pretty close after I'd left government. He asked, can I work on the project with them in the development stage? And I said yes, so they hired me. About a year into that, and I can't remember if Williams was still alive at the time, or whether it was Eli Jacobs. I don't remember who the ownership group was at the time, but the issue came up about the naming of Camden Yards. And so Larry said to me, we got a problem. We are at odds with Don, he referred to Schaefer as Don, over the naming of Camden Yards, naming of the ballpark. I said, okay, what are the parameters here? Who's saying what? He said, well, we want Oriole Park. I said, well, that makes sense to me, but just help me understand why so I can explain the why. He goes, well, we want to throw back to a historical time, and we want to connect this new ballpark to its historical lineage. And the original Oriole Park was a wood structure that burned down in the 1930s, but it was nonetheless part of the history and lore of the name Orioles. And we think that because we're trying to do a throwback stadium, having that name will be very valuable as a connection to the lineage of the ball club. This is long before naming rights were a big thing. I said, okay, what does the governor want? He says, the governor wants Camden Yards. I said, Camden Yards again? This is now the second time in my career that the word Camden Yards has taken on an importance that's far beyond anything anybody growing up in this area would have ever thought. I said, no, he doesn't. So Larry said, yeah, that's what he's saying. I said, no, Larry, you're missing the point. He doesn't want it called Camden Yards. He wants it called William Donald Schaefer Stadium. He said, I know that. He said, has he ever said that to you, Larry? He goes, no. So I said, what do you want me to do? He goes, would you go meet with him and see if you can iron this out? So I go meet with the governor, exchange all kinds of pleasantries. We remained very good friends even after I left government, and thought the world of him then, like I did when I worked for him. And I said, Governor, I'm a little confused about what's going on with the name. The Orioles want the name you'd expect. Oriole Park, Oriole Park, it's the lineage of the club. You don't really want Camden Yards. Nobody even knows what that is. He said, yes, I do. I said, no, you don't. He says, yes, I do. I said, Governor, please. If I were guessing, and I know you'd never say this, but if I were guessing, I would think you'd want, and rightly so, the ballpark named after you. I mean, after all, it never would have happened without you. I didn't say that. I said, I know you didn't say that. I said, but would that be a fair assumption if I were to think that? And the governor said, I didn't say that. I said, okay, so now we've got that lined up perfectly. They want Oriole Park, and you want William Donald Schaefer Stadium. No, I don't. I didn't say that. I said, Governor, I think that's what you're referring to, but I understand. Can we just agree maybe that there's another way to do this? Maybe the smarter thing to do, Don, is to name the entire complex after you. Why do you just want the ballpark? Why wouldn't you want instead of the Camden Yards complex, why couldn't it be the William Donald Schaefer complex? I don't want that. I said, what do you mean you don't want that? I don't want that. I said, okay, but then why don't you want Oriole Park? I don't want that. I said, geez, we're not getting anywhere, Governor. All right, well, I'll report back. So I go back to Lucchino and I tell him, we're getting nowhere. He clearly wants you to name the ballpark after him. We're not doing that. I said, no, we're not doing that. But that's what he wants. You want Oriole Park, he's sticking on Camden Yards. So after another meeting or two, I go to the governor and I said, Governor, okay, I got an idea. I'm going to hold you to what you said. I've asked you now multiple times, do you want the stadium named after yourself? And you keep saying, no, I'm not saying that. And I take you at your word because you're a man of your word. I believe you. You want Camden Yards. The Orioles want Oriole Park. What if we put the names together? How about if we had Oriole Park at Camden Yards? Because the location's Camden Yards, the ballpark is Oriole Park. That would cure everybody's problems. He says, that's good. He thought, I think, that Lucchino would never go for it. He, in his mind, thought it would never happen. But it did happen. Because when I went back and presented it, Larry, in his genius, started thinking to himself, Oriole Park at Camden Yards. We can monetize Oriole Park. We can monetize Camden Yards. We can have 2 sets of t-shirts, 2 sets of hats, 2 sets of licensing, 2 sets of protected product. Maybe that works. And they accepted it, contrary to, I think, what Schaefer ever expected in a million years that they accepted it. But they did. And I've always said that my law firm in the sports division was established on a preposition. I got paid to do that, which is kind of amazing. So that's the history of the name Oriole Park at Camden Yards. And it has turned out to be just that, incredibly valuable. So Larry felt bad. I felt bad. We all felt bad. We tried a couple of other times to get him to agree to the complex being named the Schaefer Complex. And by the way, there's a historical example of that. The Meadowlands was named after the governor, I can't think of his name, of New Jersey. Meadowlands did that, named it after the governor of the whole sports complex. So it could have been named after him. Brendan Burns. And they created the Brendan Burns Arena and all kinds of stuff to give homage to the governor. So we decided what we'll do is at least create an homage to the governor. We created the Schaefer Circle upon entrance, and he didn't show up when we had the naming of it.
There were some who had advocated calling it Babe Ruth Stadium since he was born in Baltimore and had played for the Orioles, and his father's tavern was just a few blocks in birthplace, or a few blocks from Oriole Park at Camden Yards. So there were a lot of ideas kicked around, and I would say that Camden Yards was probably, in many ways, the clear favorite, but I think when it came time to make an actual choice, the Orioles felt that having their name in the name was important, maybe in part for trademark reasons, so that they would own the rights to apparel and the use of the name. My memory's kind of vague on what thumb we had on the scale at the time, but it's sort of a famous story that's almost true, that Eli Jacobs, our owner, suggested Oriole Park, and Governor Schaefer suggested Camden Yards, and they compromised by Oriole Park at Camden Yards. That's a little bit of a short version of maybe a longer truth, but I think it's proven to be a good name and allows us to use both interchangeably.
We came up with a combination name with the governor one day at lunch, and we argued over prepositions, which should be in between Oriole Park, or should it be Camden Yards, or should it be Oriole Park of Camden Yards, or at Camden Yards, and so we came up with a combination stadium in order to please everyone. Combination ballpark name, excuse me, I always slipped into the stadium jargon.
I don't want to sound casual about it, but honestly, I didn't care what they called it as long as they told me what the name was so I could build the signs.
when we did put that sign up, Oriole Park at Camden Yards, we did have to put something behind it because since there was a lot more letters, they were smaller. And that made it stand out so that you could read it from a distance. Otherwise, it did kind of hide a little bit up there. I forgot about that.